Ernest Hemingway, one of the most influential writers in American literature. Many touched by his art feel admiration, even reverence, a need to go beyond his writing to know him as a man. A certain mystique about Hemingway comes from so many colorful descriptions and anecdotes which attempt to tell us what he was really like. It has been over 35 years since Hemingway died, and somewhere between the tall tales and the final unknowable truth is the opportunity to hear from today's foremost Hemingway scholars and people who actually knew him, Idahoans who knew him during the best and the worst times of his life. What emerges is a portrait of the man that perhaps has never been fully appreciated. Hemingway was born in Oak Park, Illinois in 1899. His writing talent bloomed during his school years, yet he skipped college and set out to travel the world. The chapters of his life included Michigan, France, Florida, Spain, Africa, Cuba, the combat theaters of Europe, and more. He was an avid sportsman and a respectable athlete. By the age of 30, he had achieved worldwide notoriety as a novelist. In 1954, he was awarded a Nobel Prize. He wrote of high action and romance, and he lived the same. But our story focuses on his experiences here in Ketchum and Sun Valley, Idaho. For it was here that Hemingway enjoyed the beautiful country and rugged sports afield he so cherished. And it was here, in deep despair, that he took his own life. Hemingway loved the West, its wide open spaces and opportunity for sport. In the fall of 1939, he was vacationing in Wyoming, and here in Idaho, Averill Harriman's luxury resort of Sun Valley had just been completed near Ketchum. Harriman modeled Sun Valley in the grand European tradition, and he was looking for celebrity guests to build its reputation.
I think Mr. Hannigan was instrumental in bringing Mr. Hemingway here as a name to help, quote, glamorize, unquote, glamorize Sun Valley.
Steve Hannigan was a publicity genius and orchestrated Sun Valley events from his East Coast offices. In the case of Ernest Hemingway, his timing was perfect.
In the fall of 1939, Hemingway was staying at the Elbar T Ranch in Wyoming with his second wife, Pauline, and their two young sons, Gregory and Patrick. Hemingway had been, for the past 2 years, carrying on an affair with Martha Gellhorn, who's a war correspondent he met during the Spanish Civil War.
He was sneaking off to be with Martha Gellhorn that fall. He wasn't divorced from Pauline yet. And that fall of 39, and he met her after Pauline and the kids had gone back to Key West.
He was at really a point of decision about his marriage to Pauline. And he did walk out on Pauline, call Martha, ask her to meet him, and the two of them drove on together to Idaho.
Hannigan's man in the local Sun Valley office, Gene Van Gilder, and Lloyd Arnold, a Union Pacific photographer, were the first to meet Hemingway. They showed him the rugged, wide-open country of southern Idaho, and he liked what he saw. It reminded him of places he knew and loved.
The terrain is very, very similar to Spain. He also had spent a lot of time in Spain's Basque provinces, and he was attracted to a place where Basque people lived. He was a seeker of frontiers. He also really detested government regulation of all kinds. He was a real minimalist as far as government was concerned. He felt the only effective unit of government was the village, and he liked to live in a small town where people knew each other and had a real impact on what was happening around them.
Today, Sun Valley is a family destination, but in the early days, it was all glitz and glamour. There's plenty of evidence in Hemingway's writing that he thought rich people were boring. The high-class clientele didn't interest Hemingway. Along with the unspoiled country, he liked the resort employees. Many were native Idahoans.
It was the employees up here that were the backbone of the community. They used to kid people that they had a better class of employees here than they did of guests.
The kind of people who worked here from the farm communities who were absolutely straight, and the fact that there was this whole zone to the south that had all this great sport that was really untouched. Nobody was using it, you know. And I think that's what really fascinated him the most. People who became fast friends of his for years afterward. They really made the place for him.
When Hemingway first arrived in Sun Valley, some of his greatest literary successes were still ahead of him. But he was already a celebrity, an artist, an intellectual in the prime of his life.
His first collection of short stories in our time that was published in 1925 was an absolutely revolutionary work. It changed American literature, it changed the way we write forever.
He was an American phenomena. Very, very few, I can't think of any American writer except Mark Twain who had that same kind of public aura as well as a body of fiction that was very important.
At this point in his career, Hemingway could probably find open doors and admiration anywhere in the world. Yet he chose Idaho, and Idaho chose him. His friends were impressed at first, but the portrait of the brash, arrogant adventurer slowly changed as they got to know him.
When I first met him, he was a macho man.
He was a big man, muscular man, handsome man, dark hair, pretty brown eyes. He was 40 years old, and he looked just a picture of health.
If he walked into a room, you'd see him. And not because he was making noise or doing anything like that, but simply because he had that sort of presence.
Well, he was kind of a man's man, you know. He wanted to be thought as a real macho kind of a guy, and he was, in a way, maybe not quite as much as he thought he was, but he was a macho kind of a guy. He wasn't going around trying to make friends with everyone. I mean, he liked certain people, and he wasn't a guy slapping everyone on the back, and kind of a private person.
He had an absolutely marvelous sense of humor, and we had great fun, as well as having many serious, interesting conversations.
I wouldn't recognize him, Mr. Hemingway, on the basis of my experiences with him. By reading the stories that I've heard about him in other places, I think that I can understand why there are many variations in descriptions of the man, depending on their exposures to him.
He was a very kind and generous man, and as I agree with John, we saw him out here in a completely different environment than these other wild stories that we've all read and heard.
I saw him drink. I saw him drink at parties and at dinners and before and after, and with Cooper and others, you know. But I never saw him drunk. Now, he may have been, but he could sure handle it.
I believe that his biographers have done him an injustice, because they haven't given you the whole man at all. And perhaps I didn't know the whole man either.
Any biography that looks objectively at Hemingway's behavior is going to uncover some behavior that's very irresponsible and very unpleasant. Biographers are naturally attracted to problematic behavior. They're going to look at difficult moments, questionable things that people do or say.
You just have to accept that in biographers, that each one is going to be biased in some way or have some flaw in his own character that shows up in the writing.
Certainly, Carlos Baker's book makes him appear to be a son of a bitch, and I think this is the one thing he wasn't.
Baker had the full cooperation of Hemingway's widow Mary. He had access to tremendous amounts of material, letters, and he was a scholar. He worked very hard to verify every single thing that he says in that book, and he provides copious documentation.
The Baker biography is the who, what, where. The sense of the man is not always present.
One of the things I think the Sons feel has never been captured, and I would agree with them on this, is just how charismatic Hemingway was and how much fun he was to be with. When he was in a good mood, it would be difficult to think of a better companion. He was a wonderful storyteller. He was an inventor of fun and exciting things to do. He was a wonderful listener who could make people around him feel very, very special.
He was a person who was fun to be with and a person who that kept people laughing all the time.
In Sun Valley, Hemingway had found a place where he could relax and enjoy himself. And again, it wasn't just the scenery and the hunting opportunities, it was the people. Many of the employees of Sun Valley were natives of South Central Idaho, or at least they lived here long enough to know and appreciate the land. But one of the first people Hemingway really took a shine to was head guide Taylor Williams.
He was a self-educated man. He came from Kentucky. He was living in Gooding, Idaho when he came up when Sun Valley opened. First he came as a guide and then finally got into the so-called head guide. He originated the Renegade Fly. He was a good fisherman and good wing shot and was just a fine gentleman to be around.
Hemingway placed a great deal of importance on doing things well, whether it be riding, boxing, or bullfighting. And in Idaho, Hemingway found people who knew the business of bird hunting. So along with Taylor Williams, Gene Van Gilder, Lloyd Arnold, and other straight shooters, the sports afield began. They ventured over the farmlands and deserts of south central Idaho, enjoying rugged and beautiful country, abundant game, long walks, and frank talks. The hunters were bound together by common interest and good times, and Hemingway showed his allegiance to the group when all too soon, tragedy struck. Gene Van Gilder was one of the first people Hemingway met in Sun Valley. They hunted together for about 6 weeks and had become good friends. Veteran hunters Van Gilder and Arnold were in a canoe on the Snake River with a young Sun Valley staffer. Hemingway was not along on this trip. Through inexperience, miscommunication, or just plain carelessness, the young man accidentally shot Van Gilder in the back at point-blank range. Despite rescue efforts by the young man and Arnold, Van Gilder died within an hour.
Papa wrote the eulogy. His wife asked, or Gene's wife, Nin, asked if he would write something. So he did. And he said to us, he let us see it, to see what we thought of it. And I said, Papa, it's beautiful.
Best of all, he loved the fall. The leaves yellow on the cottonwoods. Leaves floating in the trout streams. And above the hills, the high, blue, windless skies. Now he will be a part of them forever.
In that first Idaho fall of 1939, Hemingway was finishing For Whom the Bell Tolls. He wrote it in Suite 206 here at the Sun Valley Lodge. And when the novel was completed, Lloyd Arnold, Hemingway's hunting companion and a professional photographer, composed a picture for the dust cover of the book.
For Whom the Bell Tolls came out in October 21, 1940. And it was an instant bestseller. It was Book of the Month Club. It was a huge book, bigger than anything that he'd ever done before.
For Whom the Bell Tolls was a giant bestseller for its time and made him a tremendous amount of money.
He wanted to have lunch up at the Alpine one day for some reason or other, and so I said, fine. So I met him for lunch, and we were sitting there, and he said, we better have a jug of wine. So, and I don't know whether they didn't serve wine or something, because he got up and went across the liquor stores, which is right across the street, and got a bottle of wine, and we opened that up, and we was having a little wine. He says, boy, he says, I had a wonderful morning this morning. I said, well, what'd you do? And I said, how come? And he says, I wrote 1,000 words, and it's worth $1 a word.
During the winter of 1940, before For Whom the Bell Tolls was published, Hemingway returned to Cuba and his beloved Finca Bahia. The estate outside Havana was very special to him, And that summer, Taylor Williams was invited to visit and enjoy the challenge of fishing the Gulf Stream. For the rest of his life, the Finca Bahia in Cuba and Ketchum, Idaho would be Hemingway's personal retreats.
As Hemingway became more famous as a writer, remoteness became really important to him, and that's another thing that Cuba and Idaho had in common. The more famous he became, the farther out he needed to be in order to get work done without people bothering him. In both Cuba and Idaho, gambling was still permitted. Game laws were not really a factor in Idaho during those days. Deep sea fishing in Cuba was less regulated than it was in the United States.
He resented those